Hi, good evening. I hope you've been keeping well. It's been quite a while since I uh, came back to the Adda, and this evening I have a very interesting book to discuss with you. It's a book that I read a few months back, and uh, it was a very timely read for me because it helped me to deal with certain situations in my life, and it so happened to be a great coincidence in that sense. I will come to that point a little later, but first the book itself. So, this is a book that some of you may have come across. It's called Being Mortal, and the line below it says Medicine and What Matters in the End. Atul, Atul Gawande is the author, a well known doctor who practices in the US. In fact, he's a surgeon at the Brigham and uh, Boston Women's Hospital. He's also a professor at the Harvard Medical School. He has written a number of books, and perhaps as we go along, I might pick up a few of his other books and talk about them as well. Uh, Very interestingly, he's also been awarded the Lewis Thomas Prize, which is a prize given to authors for the popularization of science. That's a very uh, prestigious award that he's got. Atul Gawande is, a second generation uh, Indian, in the sense that his parents, living in the US, in the sense that his parents migrated there, and he was, of course, born in the US and did his education and so on and so forth. So, a lot of the examples that he uses in this book are from the US and from his own practice there. But I think why I picked up this book is because it has universal appeal. Uh, Let me start reading some portions of this book to give you an idea of what uh, it is. Um, and pretty much, I think Atul lays out the entire book out in his introduction. So I'm going to be reading quite a bit from the introduction itself. There are about 8 chapters in this book. It's a very, very beautiful read, unputdownable, in fact, once you start going through it. And this is how a lot of nonfiction should be actually written. Uh, Atul begins by saying in the introduction, and I quote here, I learned a lot, I learned about a lot of things in medical school, but mortality wasn't one of them. Although I was given a dry, leathery corpse to dissect in my first term, that was solely a way to learn about human anatomy. Our textbooks, I think this is a very important statement he makes right at the beginning, and it sets the tone for what is to come. Our textbooks had almost nothing on aging or frailty or dying. These are inevitable things, of course, but then they hardly find a mention in the textbooks. How the process unfolds, how people experience the end of their lives, and how it affects those around them seemed beside the point. The way we saw it, and the way our professors saw it, the purpose of medical schooling was to teach how to save lives, not how to tend to their demise. I want to repeat this. The purpose of medical schooling was to teach how to save lives, not how to tend to their demise. I think it's pretty much the same now. This is a book that was written in 2014. 8 years have passed. I don't think much has changed. But whatever little has changed in this regard is very promising, and we can learn a lot from those experiences and experiments. So that is how the book begins. He expresses a helplessness about medical education, saying that we are taught to save lives. We are not taught to deal with death in a better and more meaningful manner. And in doing so, we heap a lot of misery on the elderly. I want to read uh, further. On page 3, he says in the introduction, we paid our medical tuition to learn about the inner process of the body, the intricate mechanisms of its pathologies, and the vast trove of discoveries and technologies that have accumulated to stop them. We didn't imagine we needed to think about much else. So at that point of time, when you're dissecting human bodies, when you're into anatomy, when you're learning more and more about less and less as you dissect the body, the human body, you begin. I mean, there's nothing much that is nothing else that is there in one's mind, because it's made out to be such a technical thing. But then when doctors start practicing and they interact with people with problems, especially the elderly, you suddenly find, as Atul explains so beautifully, you suddenly find that all that medical education was very inadequate. Um, in the introduction, he gives a very telling example of a person called Joseph Lazaroff, uh, who was a city administrator and who was in the 60s, and he had come to him for uh, treatment of a metastatic prostate cancer, a cancer that is rapidly spreading. It's a very painful prostate cancer. Uh, so he describes in great detail his medical condition, and it doesn't sound good at all. Uh, and he also says that the cancer had spread to his spine, where it was compressing that spinal cord, and he was in great pain. The cancer itself couldn't be cured, and I think that's probably one of the few diseases left which we haven't been able to do much about. So as a young doctor who's part of the team that looks at this case in the hospital, he's assigned the task of talking to the patient and explaining to him the dangers and the risks of surgery, knowing fully well that whatever may be the tools that they use and whatever may be the efforts that they put in, Joseph Lazaroff is not going to get the life he had, some months back. But then the patient, Lazaroff, doesn't like that kind of a discussion. So he says, "Don't you give up on me," he said. "You give me every chance I got." And his son finds it very surprising to hear his father talk that way, because when his mother died and she was on a ventilator and she suffered a lot in her death, Lazaroff had determined at that time that he's not going to go through that process. But yet, when he himself was at that stage, he was fighting to live. He didn't want to die, and he wanted them to do their best. So what Atul Gawande says is that I believed then that Mr. Lazaroff had chosen badly. And I still believe this. He chose badly not because of all the dangers, but because the operation didn't stand a chance of giving him what he really wanted: his continence, his strength, the life he had previously known. He was pursuing little more than a fantasy at the risk of a prolonged and terrible death, which was precisely what he got. So I think the point that Atul makes through this example, and he says that the operation was a technical success. It was an 8.5 hour operation, and so on and so forth. But then it leads to a lot of other complications, and finally, Atul is assigned the task of taking Lazaroff off the artificial ventilator and allowing him to, die away, allowing him to go. He reflects, Atul Gawande reflects on this case, and he says, What strikes me most is not how bad his decision was, but how much we all avoided talking honestly about the choice before him. We had no difficulty explaining the specific dangers of various treatment options, but we never really touched on the reality of his disease. His oncologists, radiation therapists, surgeons, and other doctors had all seen him through months of treatment, probably involving so much money, thousands of dollars, for a problem that they knew could not be cured. So we could not bring ourselves to discuss the larger truth about his condition or the ultimate limits of our capabilities, let alone what might matter most to him as he neared the end of his life. He goes on to emphasize and says modern scientific capability has profoundly altered the course of human life. There is longer, life expectancy. They live longer and better than at any other time in history. But scientific advances have turned the processes of aging and dying into medical experiences, matters to be managed by healthcare professionals. And we in the medical world have proved alarmingly unprepared for it. So that is his worry. He says that medical science, and indeed most of all of medical education, is just talking about the technical aspects of how to treat a disease and how to ensure that that person lives on longer. But in the process, what is happening is that there are more and more intensive and escalatory treatments that are given to patients, which cause a lot of misery. It might prolong their life, but then is that a meaningful prolonging? Are they able to, are they able to live the way they wanted? Are there better ways of doing this? That's the question that he asks. And I think this book is about, of course, exploring what else can be done and what more needs to be done to make the final stage of the human being, the elderly human being, much better than what it is now in deathly nursing homes and hospices and elder care institutions which do not have life. So can all of that change? Can the experience of aging be made much better? I think that's the core question in this book, and the author discusses several examples, several beautiful examples which offer a lot of hope. I'll just read a little further and he says towards the end of the introduction, our reluctance to honestly examine the experience of aging and dying has increased the harm we inflict on people, as I said, and denied them the basic comforts they most need, which is human company, some love, care. Care is not to be mistaken again with medical treatment. It's a very different dimension altogether. Lacking a coherent view of how people might live successfully all the way to their very end. I repeat, lacking a coherent view of how people might live successfully all the way to their very end, we have allowed our fates to be controlled by the imperatives of medicine, technology, and strangers. Of course, strangers being the doctors and so on. And he ends that introduction by asking this very pertinent question, and what if there are better approaches right in front of our eyes, waiting to be recognized? And indeed, this wonderful book, which I believe should be made a textbook for every course in medicine, is a book of hope. Ultimately, it's not a book of it's not a lament, it's not a book of despair. In chapter 5, which is titled A Better Life, Atul really explores what are the possibilities of making making the final years better, even if there is disease. We know that death is a finality. Everybody is going to die one day. We know that disease is inevitable. But rather than treating it as if it's a war or an emergency, can we Can we manage it better? Can we pay more attention to what people really want at that stage, which is they want to live? I mean, it's as simple as that, which means human company, uh, having entertaining deeper purpose in life, even at that stage, and not, in that sense, living in despair and hopelessness and boredom and anxiety, every hour and every day. So, how can those experiences be enriched? So, in chapter 5, he gives a very beautiful example. Uh, uh, you know, uh, whose credit, in fact, goes to this very young physician called Bill Thomas, who performs uh, in New York in 1991 a very courageous, very innovative, and daring experiment at the Chase Memorial Nursing Home. And reading this is really a delight. So, the long and short of this is that Bill Thomas. Uh, uh, Physician who's educated at Harvard Medical School and so on, gets into this nursing home. He joins this nursing home and he sees how depressing the whole place is. It's almost as if people are just waiting to die there. And uh, he then, asks himself, what is it that I can make this place better? What is it that I can do to bring the smiles back on, people's faces? And he proposes to the medical board of the hospital, much against uh, their liking, of course, in the beginning. They're very reluctant. He says, can we get more pets in the nursing home? Can we get more live plants in the nursing home? Can we organize a lot more activities? Can children come in and interact with the elderly and so on? And it is found that all these changes that ultimately are made, and they win a grant for bringing about all of these birds and animals and so on and so forth. So at one point, I think uh, I just want to read. This is a very nice uh, collection, actually. I think at one point, oh yes, the inhabitants of Chase Memorial Nursing Home now included 100 parakeets, 4 dogs, 2 cats, plus a colony of rabbits and a flock of laying hens. There were also hundreds of indoor plants and a thriving vegetable and flower garden. The home had on-site childcare for the staff and a new after-school program. So I think the point that is basically made over here is, can we inject life rather than confining people uh, to a very uh, depressing nursing home existence or institutional existence, and can that change? So I think the book is, of course, peppered with wonderful examples. People who chose to do both the things, people who chose to fight knowing fully well that they're going to have a miserable death and end, and people who said, yes, I recognize that I have a problem, I'm going to die, but in the remaining time that I have with me, probably a few months, a few years, can I make that as good as possible and not fritter it away? Can I find for myself a sense of deeper purpose? Can I engage with some of those activities, and so on and so forth? I think it's a fantastic book of inspiration and hope. Atul also, of course, has a personal sharing of how his own father, a doctor, uh, dealt with his mortality at the end. And it's a very illustrative experience and example from which we all can learn. Now, the personal sharing that I want to do is, my father passed away on the 11th of February at the age of 97. And I was confronted by difficult decisions towards the end when he was hospitalized, and when the doctors were asking me if they could uh, do certain things to uh, keep him alive or revive him. And what I found was, 2 or 3 hospitals that we tried to admit him in Bangalore all insisted that he must go to the intensive care unit, and they all insisted that he should be on the ventilator. What I think this book and the insights that I got from this book came to my mind at that time, and I asked myself, do I really want to do this for him and prolong his suffering? We won't even know if he's going to come back to us uh, in the state that he was probably a week or 10 days ago, when he was walking around in the garden, able to change his clothes and take his bath, and so on and so forth. Uh, and the other issue was that I think one of the things that Atul probably doesn't mention um, so much explicitly, but it's very obvious that the more you fight, the disease with all kinds of treatments and the best of medical technology and treatments and so on, the costs increase, they escalate, and for many families, for most middle class families, uh, that is something that cannot be managed at all. So this is another dimension, and in fact, I'm sorry to say, but it's become a big business by itself. So saving people has become a big business for everybody. Doctors are given those targets that you have to give this, and this kind of treatment costing this much of rupees, and so on. So it's all done in a very ruthless, unemotional manner, and it really leaves the family of the concerned person, struggling for breath, struggling for money, and there is no solution in sight ultimately. So uh, a lot of escalatory treatments were suggested for my father, including intubation, ventilator, and they gave me an average, a sense of the average costs per day, which would be in the region of 1 to 1.5 lakhs, and so on and so forth. And I think ultimately what I decided, and I gave an undertaking, a written undertaking, it was a very difficult decision. Losing a parent is not easy, whatever the age might be of that parent. It's a life changing event that happens. Very difficult, and to deal with it, and that void never can be filled. But then when I looked into all these aspects with as calm a head as possible, I realized that I would be subjecting my father to more suffering. And instead, I said, let's do what it takes to keep him comfortable. Let's do what it takes to minimize his distress. And let's not pump him with the most intensive treatments and technologies and so on. So that is where I think being mortal came in very useful. And as I said, it's a very funny and strange coincidence that I read the book a few months before my dad passed away. So I urge you to buy a copy, and I urge you to share this book with people you care about. Do share it with young doctors if you know them. Do share it with students of medicine who may be part of your family, your extended family, friends, colleagues, and so on. So this is something that as you go through the book carefully, you will realize how many insights it has about how we view death, mortality, aging, and how we view the elderly, persons themselves. So thank you very much for this patient listening, and do share with me your thoughts and comments on this. I look forward to another session very quickly on Giri's Adda. Bye bye.